I shouldn't have hit record, but the rain was loud enough to hide everything and I needed clean audio for my next episode. So I sat there in my car outside a quiet building on 47th Street, watching water crawl down the windshield like it had somewhere important to be. My mic resting on the dashboard, the red light blinking steady, my voice low as I whispered an intro about unsolved crimes and forgotten names. It was supposed to be just background noise, just atmosphere, until it wasn't, because somewhere between the thunder and the distant hum of traffic, another sound slipped in, voices not close, but not far either, controlled, deliberate, the kind of voices that don't rush and don't repeat themselves. I froze, my hand still wrapped around my coffee, gone cold minutes ago, and I listened. One sentence cut through clearer than the rest. No witnesses. My heart stuttered, not fear exactly, just that sharp awareness that I was hearing something real, something not meant for anyone outside that moment. I told myself it could be anything, a movie line, a late-night argument, anything normal, anything safe. But my fingers were already reaching for the recorder, already saving the file. Like instinct knew before I did that this mattered, that this was the kind of story people waited for, the kind that turned small channels into something bigger, something louder. I drove home with the rain still chasing my headlights, replaying the audio over and over, the voices. Never raised, never chaotic, just quiet certainty. And that made it worse. I edited until 1:12 a.m., cutting my intro, layering the sound underneath, letting that one sentence linger, just enough to make people lean in. I uploaded a teaser, told myself I'd decide in the morning whether to take it down, but by 2:03 a.m. it had already started climbing views faster than anything I'd ever posted, comments flooding in, theories, guesses, excitement. I should have felt proud. Instead, I felt watched, like the room had shifted slightly, like the air knew something. I locked my door, checked the windows twice, laughed at myself for being dramatic, and then my phone buzzed. No caller ID, just a number that didn't belong to any place I knew. I stared at it longer than I should have before answering, saying nothing, just listening. At first there was only silence, the kind that isn't empty, just controlled, and then a voice, low, calm, precise, the kind that doesn't need to be loud to be heard. You should delete that. My throat tightened. I didn't ask what he meant. I didn't have to, because he said my name next, Emily. And the way he said it made it feel like he'd been saying it for years, like he'd known exactly when I would pick up, exactly when I would listen. I tried to speak, tried to ask who this was, but the words stayed somewhere behind my teeth, and all he said was, take it down tonight, before the line went dead, leaving me alone with the sound of my own breathing and the soft blinking red light on my recorder still running, like it was waiting for the next thing I wasn't supposed to hear. I did not sleep. I just sat there on the edge of my bed, watching the reflection of my phone screen fade in and out against the dark window, replaying his voice in my head, calm, certain, like he already knew what I would do next. I told myself it was a bluff, that people did not just get your number, your name, your space that easily. But my apartment felt smaller after that call, like the walls had moved an inch closer. Without asking, I stood up, paced once, twice, then opened my laptop. The video was still live, views climbing faster now, comments stacking over each other, asking questions. I did not have answers to strangers telling me this was the best thing I had ever posted, and for a second I felt it. That pull, that hunger. This is what you wanted. This is what you worked for, recognition, attention, a story that mattered. But then I hovered over the file, the raw audio, sitting there untouched, and I noticed something I had missed before. A second voice underneath, the first quieter, almost careful, like it was choosing every word. And I leaned closer, turned the volume up until the room disappeared, and all I could hear was that recording. And then I caught it, not words exactly, more like a name spoken too softly, too noticed the first time, and my stomach dropped. Because I knew that name, not personally, but from articles, from headlines, from the kind of stories that never stayed online for long. Luca Moretti. I sat back too fast, my chair scraping the floor, the sound louder than it should have been. I stared at the screen like it might change if I looked long enough. But it did not. The name stayed there, woven into the audio like it belonged. And suddenly the call made sense, not just a warning, not just a stranger, but someone who existed in places I only talked about, never touched. I reached for my phone. Again, checked the number, nothing, no location, no history, just empty. And that was worse than anything, because it meant there was nothing to trace, nothing to understand, just him deciding when to appear and when to disappear. I should have deleted it. I know that now. I should have ended it right there, closed the laptop, gone to sleep, pretended none of this happened. But instead, I did the opposite. I downloaded the file twice, saved it to a drive I never used, labeled it something random, like it could hide what it really was, and then I sat there, Listening again to that quiet second voice, to the way it carried authority without effort, to the way everything around it seemed to follow without question, and I whispered his name once just to hear it out loud, just to make it real, and the moment I did, the lights flickered once, not off, just enough to remind me that I was not in control of this anymore. I looked toward the door, not because I heard anything, but because I felt it, that shift again, that same feeling from earlier, like something had already crossed into my world without needing permission, and my phone buzzed again, this time a message, no number, just words, simple, direct, "You are still listening," and I realized with a clarity that made my chest tighten that he was not asking me to stop, he was watching to see if I would. The message stayed on my screen longer than it should have, like it was waiting for me to react, like silence itself had waited, and I realized my hands were shaking. Not out of fear, not exactly, but because something had shifted again. I was no longer just someone who recorded stories. I was inside one. I typed nothing back, just stared at the words, "You are still listening," as if they might change if I gave them enough time, but they did not. They just sat there quiet and certain, like everything else about him. I swallowed hard, closed the message, and forced myself to move, because standing still felt like giving in. I grabbed my jacket, my keys, told myself I needed air, that I needed something normal, something real outside my apartment. But even the hallway felt different, like every sound echoed a second too long, like someone could be standing just out of sight, and I would not know until it was too late. I stepped outside, the city still awake, neon reflections on wet pavement, cars passing like nothing had changed, and for a moment I almost convinced myself that nothing had, that this was all in my head, until I reached my car and stopped, because the windshield was clean, too clean, no rain, no streaks, like someone had wiped it down recently. I stood there staring at it, my breath catching in a way I could not explain, because I had not touched it since earlier, and I knew the rain had not stopped long enough to leave it like that. I looked around slowly, the street empty, no one watching, at least no one I could see, but that feeling again, it pressed in, quiet and steady, like a presence without a face. I got into the car anyway, locked the doors immediately, my fingers moving faster than my thoughts, and I sat there listening to the engine idle, to my own breathing, to the silence that felt anything but empty. I should have gone back inside. I should have ended it there, but instead I reached for my recorder again, like something inside me refused to stop. I played the file one more time, volume low this time, careful, like I did not want anyone else to hear, even though I was alone. And then it happened, something I knew had not been there before, a faint sound after the voices ended, not words, not exactly, more like a shift, a movement, a door closing softly, and then a single breath, close enough to the mic that it felt impossible, like whoever it was had been standing right next to me. When I recorded it, my chest tightened. I paused the audio, rewound, played it again, the same sound, the same impossible closeness. And that was when my phone lit up once more. Not a call, not a message, just a notification from my own account. The teaser video gone, completely removed, no warning, no explanation, like it had never existed. And before I could even process that, another message appeared, simple, precise, "You are learning." And for the first time since this started, I understood something that made everything colder. This was not about stopping me, this was about guiding me. And I did not know which was worse. The engine was still running, but I did not remember turning the key, and that was the first thing that unsettled me. The second was how quiet everything felt, like the city had stepped back just enough to let something else take its place. I stared at the message, "You are learning," and for a moment I almost laughed, because it sounded like approval, not a threat. And that made it worse. I closed my eyes, pressed my fingers against my temples, trying to slow my thoughts. But they would not stop, because nothing about this was random, not the call, not the messages, not the way my video disappeared without a trace. This was controlled, precise, and invisible, and I was inside it whether I wanted to be or not. I opened my eyes and looked at the empty passenger seat beside me, the same place my recorder had been earlier, and a thought slipped in, quiet but sharp. What if I had not been alone that night? The idea settled into my chest, heavy and undeniable, because that breath on the recording, it had been too close, too real, like someone had leaned in just enough to exist without being seen. I turned off the engine finally, the sudden silence louder than the sound had been, and stepped out of the car slower this time, more aware of every movement, every shadow stretching under the streetlights. I told myself to go back upstairs, to lock the door, to pretend this was something I could still walk away from, but my feet did not move in that direction. Instead, I found myself looking across the street at the building where I had recorded everything earlier, its windows dark, now no sign of movement, no hint that anything had happened there at all. And yet, I knew better. I crossed without thinking, each step deliberate, like I was following something I could not see. The rain had stopped completely, leaving the pavement smooth, and reflective the entrance door unlocked, when it should not have been. That alone was enough to make me pause. But curiosity pulled harder than caution. Ever had I stepped inside the lobby, dim lights humming overhead, the air cooler than outside, carrying that same quiet tension I had started to recognize, like the space itself was aware of me. I moved toward the corner where I had parked earlier, where my car had been, where I had believed I was alone, and I stopped because something small caught my attention near the curb. Not obvious, not place to be found, but not hidden either. A single black card resting against the concrete edge. I bent down slowly, my fingers hesitating just before touching it, like I already knew it mattered. When I finally picked it up, it felt heavier than it should have. Smooth matte surface, no design, no logo, just a name pressed into the center, Luca Moretti, and beneath it a number. Nothing else, no explanation, no threat, no instruction, just an invitation. Or maybe something closer to a decision. I did not remember making. I straightened up, the card still in my hand, my pulse steady now in a way that surprised me, because fear had shifted into something else, something sharper, something that felt like understanding. He had not been chasing me, he had been waiting. And as I looked back toward the empty street, I realized the choice was no longer about whether I would walk away. It was about whether I would call. I stood there longer than I should have, the card still between my fingers, like it had weight beyond paper, like it carried something that had already decided the direction of my life. And I realized I was not asking myself whether I should call him anymore. I was asking what would happen if I did not, because everything about the last few hours had been precise, too precise to be chance. My video disappearing, the messages appearing the way he knew exactly when I was listening, and now this, a number placed exactly where I would find it, not hidden, not forced, just waiting. I looked down at it again. Luca Moretti. The name felt different now, not distant, not something from articles or whispered stories, but something real, something that had already stepped into my world without asking permission. I took a slow breath, pulled my phone from my pocket, and hesitated just long enough to feel it, that moment where everything could still turn back, where I could drop the card, walk away, go upstairs, and pretend none of this had ever happened. But the thought did not last, because I already knew I would not be left alone, not after what I had heard, not after what I had kept. My thumb hovered over the screen, then moved almost on its own, dialing the number. Before I could overthink it, the phone rang once, twice, and then it clicked. No greeting, no static, just silence, the same controlled silence from before. And I realized he had been expecting this. Luca. I said his name carefully, like it might shift something if I said it wrong. There was a pause, not long, but deliberate, and then his voice came through, calm as ever, not surprised, not questioning. I was wondering how long it would take you. I swallowed, my eyes scanning the empty street like I might see him somewhere. Watching. You left this for me, I said, holding the card tighter. Even though he could not see it, I did not leave it, he replied, and something in his tone made my chest tighten. You found it. The distinction mattered more than it should have, like he was correcting the way I understood everything about this. You have been guiding this, I said before I could stop myself, the word slipping out because it felt true, because nothing about this felt accidental. Another pause, softer this time, almost like approval. I prefer to think of it as giving you a choice, a choice. I repeated the word, sounding smaller out loud, because it did not feel like one, not when every step had led me exactly here, not when he had known I would call. You recorded something you were not meant to hear, he continued, his voice steady, like he was explaining something simple, and you kept it. You listened again. That was your choice. I closed my eyes for a second, the memory of that audio pressing in the quiet voice, the name, the breath too close to be real, and I realized he was right, not about the situation, but about me. I had not stopped. I had not walked away. I had leaned in, and now I was here. What happens now? I asked the question, leaving my mouth before I could measure it, because part of me already needed to know, needed to understand the shape of what I had stepped into on purpose. This time the silence stretched longer, and when he spoke again, it was softer, not less powerful, just closer, like distance no longer mattered now. You listen, he said, and for the first time since this began, I felt it clearly. This was not the beginning of a story I was telling. This was the moment I became part of one. His words stayed with me long after the call ended, not loud, not threatening, just certain. Now you listen, like he had handed me a role I had already accepted without realizing it. I lowered the phone slowly, the screen dimming in my hand as the city noise returned in fragments, distant tires passing, a faint hum from somewhere above, but everything felt filtered, like I was hearing it through something else. I looked down at the card again, then back at the building across the street, And for the first time, I noticed a light on in one of the upper windows, not bright, not obvious, just there steady like it had been waiting for me to see it. I told myself it meant nothing that people lived here, that lights turned on and off every night. But I did not move, I just stood there watching it like it might reveal something if I stayed long enough. And then my phone buzzed again. Not a call, not a message this time, just a location pin, no text, no explanation, just an address I did not recognize. I stared at it, my thumb hovering over the screen as my mind caught up to what was happening. This was the next step, not forced, not demanded, just offered the same way everything else had been, and I understood the pattern now. He did not push, he presented and waited for me to choose. I let out a slow breath, my pulse steady in a way that felt unfamiliar, like fear had settled into focus instead of panic. I opened the map, the location only a few miles away, maybe 15 minutes, with no traffic, closer than I expected, closer than I wanted. I glanced back at my apartment building behind me, then at my car, then at the glowing pin on my phone, and the decision happened the same way the others had, quiet, almost effortless, like it had been made before I noticed I was making it. I got into the car again, this time without hesitation, the engine starting on the first turn like it had been waiting to. I placed the card on the passenger seat beside me, the name catching the streetlight for a second before fading. As I pulled away, the drive felt shorter than it should have, the roads mostly empty, the city stretching out in familiar lines that suddenly felt different, like I was seeing it from a new angle, not as someone passing through, but as someone being led through. I followed the directions exactly, every turn precise, until the map told me to stop in front of a building that did not match what I expected. It was not hidden, not abandoned, not anything dramatic, just a quiet structure tucked between two others, its exterior clean, its windows dark, except for one on the second floor, the same kind of light I had seen earlier, steady, intentional. I turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, my hands resting on the wheel, my reflection faint in the glass looking back at me like I was already someone else. I reached for the door handle, paused, then let my hand fall away because something else had caught my attention. Movement, subtle, almost unnoticeable, but enough. A figure stepping into the light inside that second floor window, not fully visible, just a silhouette, still and composed like it had been there the entire time, watching the street, watching me. I felt my breath slow instead of quicken, that same shift again, that quiet understanding that I was not arriving somewhere new. I was stepping into something that had already begun. And then my phone buzzed one last time, a single line appearing on the screen before I could look away. Come upstairs. I did not remember unlocking the car door, but I was already outside, standing still for a second too long as the cool night air settled around me, and that single message stayed on my screen: come upstairs. No explanation, no urgency, just certainty. Like everything else about him, I looked up again at the second floor window, the light still there, the silhouette gone now, or maybe just stepped back far enough that I could not see it anymore. And for a moment, I wondered if this was the point where people turned around, where instinct finally won over curiosity, but my feet were already moving before that thought could take hold. The building entrance opened without resistance, the handle cold under my fingers like it had not been touched in hours. The lobby inside was quiet, not empty, just quiet in a way that made every small sound feel deliberate. My steps echoed softly against the polished floor, each one reminding me that I was choosing this, that no one had forced me through that door. I glanced at the stairwell, then the elevator, both equally, still equally waiting, and I chose the stairs, the movement grounding me, each step measured, my hand brushing lightly against the railing as I climbed one flight, then another, until I reached the second floor and paused. The hallway stretched out ahead of me, lined with closed doors identical in shape and color, but only one of them held light beneath it, faint and steady like a signal. I walked toward it slower, now aware of everything: the quiet hum of electricity behind the walls, the distant city noise filtered through glass, the sound of my own breathing, steady but deeper than before. I stopped just outside the door, my hand hovering inches away from the handle, not out of fear, but because something in me recognized this moment as something that could not be undone, not because of what might happen, but because of what I had already become by getting this far. I exhaled once, then pushed the door open without knocking. The room inside was not what I expected. It was simple, almost minimal: a desk near the window, a chair opposite it, shelves along one wall, no signs of chaos, no evidence of anything hidden, just control, clean and intentional. And then I saw him standing near the window, exactly where the light had been coming from earlier, his back to me. At first his posture relaxed, but not careless, like he did not need to turn around to know I was there. The door closed softly behind me, the sound quiet, but final, and only then did he move, turning just enough that I could see his face, not fully shadowed, not fully clear, but enough to understand why his voice had carried the way it did, calm, precise, completely aware. His eyes met mine, without hesitation, without surprise, like this moment had already played out in his mind long before I stepped into it. "You came," he said simply, and it was not a question. I swallowed the space between us, suddenly feeling smaller than it had outside, not because of him, but because of what he represented: the room, the silence, the way everything seemed to revolve around his presence. "You wanted me to," I replied, the words steadier than I expected, and something shifted in his expression, not amusement, not approval, just recognition, like he had been waiting for that exact answer. "I did not want you," he said quietly. "I gave you a direction." The distinction settled between us heavier than anything else that had been said, and for the first time since this started, I understood the truth of it. I had followed every step, not because I was pushed, but because I chose to, and now standing in front of him, I realized there was no version of this where I was just an observer anymore. I had stepped into his world, and he had been watching me do it the entire time. The silence between us did not feel empty. It felt measured, like every second was being placed exactly where it belonged, and I realized he had not moved any closer, yet the space between us had already changed. I held his gaze longer than I expected to. Like looking away would mean giving something up. I was not ready to lose. "You knew I would come," I said quietly, the words slipping out before I could reshape them, and he tilted his head, just slightly, not denying it, not confirming it, just acknowledging the pattern I had started to see. "I knew you would choose to understand," he replied, and that word "understand" settled deeper than anything else, because it was not about curiosity anymore. It was about intention. I took a small step forward without thinking, my eyes scanning the room again. The clean lines, the absence of anything unnecessary. Everything here felt deliberate, like it existed only because it needed to, and nothing more. "You have been watching me," I said it not as an accusation, but as a realization, because it had become impossible to ignore. He did not answer right away. Instead, he walked past me slowly, not close enough to touch, but close enough that I could feel the shift in the air as he moved, and I turned to follow him. Instinctively, he stopped near the desk, resting one hand lightly against its surface, his posture relaxed, but controlled, like he was never unaware of anything in the room. "I observe outcomes," he said finally, "and not people, not moments, just the result of choices. And you, Emily, have been very consistent with yours." I felt something tighten in my chest, not fear, not quite, but something close to recognition, because he was not wrong. Every step, every decision had been mine, even when it did not feel like it. I crossed my arms lightly, not defensive, just grounding myself. "Then why me?" I asked, the question more direct than anything I had said so far. "Because I needed something real, something that was not just implication or suggestion." His eyes met mine again, sharper this time, not cold, not distant, just focused. "Because you listened," he said simply. "Most people hear something they should not, and they look away, they forget, they convince themselves it was nothing. You did not. You leaned and you repeated it. You tried to understand it, and that made you visible." The word visible echoed in my mind louder than it should have, because it carried meaning beyond what he was saying, like being seen in a way I could not control. "Is that a mistake?" I asked before I could stop myself, and for the first time something shifted in his expression, not softer, not warmer, just different, like he was considering the question instead of already knowing the answer. "That depends," he said slowly, "on what you do with it." I took another step forward, closing the distance just enough that the tension between us felt sharper, more defined, like a line drawn between two worlds, and I realized this was the moment, not dramatic, not loud, just quiet and irreversible, where I decided whether I stayed where I was or stepped further. "And what do you want me to do?" I asked, the word steady, but carrying everything underneath: the uncertainty, the curiosity, the pull. He held my gaze for a long second, then reached for something on the desk, a small device I recognized instantly, my recorder, the same one I had used earlier, the same one that had captured everything. He placed it gently in front of me, his fingers releasing it without hesitation, and said, "You are going to record the rest of the story." And for the first time since this began, I understood that this was never about stopping me. It was about making sure I told it the right way. I looked down at the recorder resting between us, the same one I had held hours ago, when everything still felt like mine to control, and for a second I did not reach for it, because something about the way he placed it there made it feel different, like it no longer belonged to me, but to whatever this had become. "You want me to tell your story?" I said slowly, my eyes lifting back to his, searching for something that felt like truth and not just direction. He did not move closer, but his presence filled the space anyway, not overwhelming, just undeniable. "I want you to tell what you hear," he corrected, his voice steady as ever, "because stories change when people try to control them. But you do not control them, you follow them." The distinction landed harder than I expected, because it meant I was not here to expose him or understand him the way I had planned. I was here to listen to something bigger than both of us, and that realization should have scared me more than it did. I reached for the recorder finally, my fingers brushing against it lightly at first, like I needed to confirm it was real before I committed to it. The surface was familiar, worn, just enough to remind me how many hours I had spent building something out of sound, out of silence, out of pieces no one else paid attention to, and now it felt heavier, not physically, but with purpose. I turned it over in my hand, then looked back at him. "What happens if I do not?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer would not be simple. He watched me for a moment longer than before, not judging, not pushing, just observing the way he had said he did. "Outcomes, not moments." "Then you will still listen," he said quietly. "You will just not understand why." The words settled into something deeper than a warning, because they did not feel like a threat, they felt like a truth I could not avoid. I exhaled slowly, my grip tightening around the recorder as something inside me shifted again. Not fear, not hesitation, but clarity. I had spent years telling stories from the outside, building narratives from fragments, trying to make sense of things that were never meant to be clear, and now, for the first time, I was standing inside one, and it was asking something from me, not permission, not approval, just attention. I lifted the recorder, pressing the button, the small click louder than it should have been in the quiet room. The red light blinked on steady, constant, and I felt it immediately, that familiar focus that settled over me when everything else fell away, when the world narrowed to sound, to breath, to the space between words. I did not look away from him as I spoke, this time my voice low but certain. "Recording began." I said the words, automatic, but different now, because they were not for an audience, not yet. They were for this moment, for whatever came next. He did not react to the words, just watched me, like he had been waiting for this exact shift, for me to stop questioning and start listening. And then he spoke, not louder, not slower, just deliberate, every word placed with intention. "What you heard earlier was not a crime," he said, and I felt my breath catch before I could stop it, because everything about this had been built on that assumption. The voices, the secrecy, the way it had all felt wrong, and now he was rewriting it with a single sentence. "It was a correction," he continued, and that word changed everything in a way I could not fully grasp yet, but I felt it like something just beneath the surface, shifting direction, and I realized, as I stood there recording his voice, capturing every detail, every pause, that this was no longer about uncovering the truth. It was about deciding which version of it would survive. The word correction echoed in my mind longer than it should have, because it did not fit with anything I thought I understood about what I had recorded. I kept my eyes on him, but my focus shifted inward, replaying every second of that audio, the tone, the pacing, the silence between the words. None of it had sounded like chaos. It had sounded controlled, intentional, like something being adjusted rather than created, and that realization settled slowly but firmly into place. "You were saying it was planned," I said, my voice steady, even as my thoughts rearranged themselves around this new version of truth. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he moved slightly to the side, just enough that the light from the window caught his face more clearly, sharp lines, calm expression, nothing hidden, but nothing offered freely either. "Everything is planned," he said finally. "The difference is whether you are aware of it." I felt a small shift in my chest, something that was not quite fear and not quite acceptance, more like the recognition of a rule I had never been taught, but was now expected to follow. I adjusted my grip on the recorder, instinctively angling it toward him, making sure his voice carried clearly, because part of me had already committed to this, to documenting whatever this was becoming. Then what was being corrected? I asked the question, quieter this time, more precise, because I understood now that the way I asked mattered as much as what I asked. He watched me for a second longer, his gaze steady, like he was measuring something, not my words, but my ability to understand the answer. "Someone stepped outside of their role," he said simply, and the words felt heavier than they should have, because they carried implication without detail. "People do that all the time," I replied before I could stop myself, the response automatic, shaped by everything I believed about choice and consequence. And for the first time, something close to amusement touched his expression, not obvious, not warm, just present. "Most people do not exist in systems that notice," he said, and that sentence shifted everything again, because it reframed what I had heard, not as an isolated moment, but as part of something structured, something that responded when it was disrupted. I felt my breath slow, my mind catching up to the shape of what he was describing, and I realized this was not about crime the way I understood it. This was about order, about control, about maintaining something that operated beneath everything else. And I had recorded a moment where that control had been adjusted. I lowered the recorder slightly, then lifted it again, refocusing, because I could feel myself drifting too far into interpretation, and that was not my role here, not anymore. What happens to the person who stepped outside? I asked, and this time the question stayed measured, careful, because I understood now that the answer would not come with explanation, just information. He held my gaze without hesitation, then spoke in the same calm tone that had carried through every word so far. They are no longer part of the system, he said, and there was no emphasis, no detail, just finality in the way he said it, like a line drawn clean and straight with nothing beyond it. I felt something tighten in my chest. Again, not from what he said, but from how easily he said it, like it was not something to question or expand on, just something that existed. I nodded slowly, more to myself than to him, the recorder still capturing every word, every pause, every shift in tone, and I realized as I stood there that this story was not unfolding in the way I expected. There was no clear beginning, no obvious end, just layers revealing themselves one decision at a time, and I was already too far in to pretend I could step back, so I steadied my voice again and asked the only thing that still felt real: if this is a system, then where do I fit in it? And this time, when he looked at me, there was no pause at all. You do not, he said quietly, you observe it. And the certainty in his voice made me understand something I had been avoiding since the moment I walked into this room. I was not being pulled into his world. I was being positioned just close enough to see it clearly, without ever belonging to it. His words should have created distance, but they did the opposite. They pulled me in closer, not physically, but mentally, like a line had been drawn, and I was standing exactly on it. You do not belong, you observe it, I repeated quietly, not to challenge him, but to understand what that actually meant, because nothing about this felt like simple observation anymore. I had followed every step, I had made every choice, and now I was here, recording his voice, capturing something that clearly was not meant for everyone to hear. That does not feel like observing, I said, my tone steady, but more direct than before, because something inside me had shifted from reacting to questioning, and for the first time since I entered the room, he moved closer, not abruptly, not in a way that startled, just enough to change the space between us from distant to deliberate. Observation is not distance, he said quietly, it is clarity. Most people confuse the two. I held his gaze as he spoke, and I realized he was not explaining this for my comfort. He was defining something I would have to decide whether I accepted or not. I lowered the recorder slightly, then lifted it again, adjusting my grip, like I needed to stay anchored to something familiar because everything else was moving too fast. Then why let me hear it, I asked, because that was the part that still did not fit. If this system was controlled, if everything was planned, then my recording, my presence, my involvement, it all felt like a variable that should have been removed, not allowed. He studied me for a moment longer than before, his expression unreadable, but focused, like he was deciding how much to give. You were not supposed to hear it, he said finally, and that aligned with everything I had assumed until now, but you were not supposed to understand it either. That part was new, and it shifted something deeper, because it meant the risk was not in the hearing, it was in the interpretation. I felt my breath slow again, my thoughts narrowing around that idea. I did not just capture something, I engaged with it, I questioned it, I followed it. And that was what made me visible, not the mistake, but the response. I took a step closer without realizing it, the recorder still between us, still recording everything. So now what, I asked, because I needed to understand the boundaries of what this had become. If I am only observing, then why bring me here? Why let me this? Close his eyes, held mine steady, unwavering, and for a moment the room felt smaller, not in a threatening way, but in a way that made everything more focused, more defined. Because observation without context is noise, he said, and the word noise struck something in me, because that had been my entire process before, filtering chaos into something that made sense to others. You wanted a story, he continued, and there was something different in his tone, now not softer, not harsher, just more direct. So I gave you the truth behind it, not the version people tell, not the one that gets attention, the one that actually exists. I felt my grip tighten around the recorder, the red light still blinking steady, capturing everything, and I realized this was the difference. I had been chasing stories that felt real, but were always incomplete, shaped by what people could see or guess. And now I was standing in front of something that did not need to be shaped, because it was already defined. I swallowed slowly, my voice quieter now, not from fear, but from understanding and what happens when I tell it, because that was the part that mattered, the part that extended beyond this room, beyond this moment. He did not answer immediately, his gaze shifting slightly, not away, but through me, like he was already considering outcomes beyond this conversation. Then you will decide what people hear, he said, and that sentence settled heavier than anything else because it placed the responsibility back on me, not as an observer, not as someone outside, but as the one who would translate this into something others could understand or misunderstand. And as I stood there holding the recorder between us, I realized the story was no longer just something I had found. It was something I would shape, whether I intended to or not. The weight of his words did not fade, it settled deeper, like something had found its place inside me. You will decide what people hear, I repeated quietly, not because I did not understand, but because I needed to feel the shape of it in my own voice, the responsibility, the control, the risk. It was everything I had wanted when I started telling stories, but never like this, never this close to something that did not need interpretation to be dangerous. I lowered the recorder for a second, my fingers tightening around it, as I looked at him differently, now not just as the source of the story, but as part of something larger, something that existed whether I chose to tell it or not. If I change it, I said slowly, choosing each word carefully, if I shape it into something else, something easier, something people can understand. His expression did not shift, but his presence seemed to sharpen slightly, not in warning, but in clarity. Then it becomes what they expect, he said simply, not what it is. I exhaled softly, the answer landing exactly where I knew it would, because that had always been the balance in every story, truth versus what people were willing to hear. But this time the distance between those two things felt wider than ever. I looked down at the recorder again, the red light still blinking, steady, patient, waiting for me to decide what it would carry beyond this room. And for the first time since this began, I hesitated, not because I did not know what to do, but because I understood the consequences of doing it. Either way, why me? I asked again, softer this time, not searching for logic, but something else, something closer to intention, because there had been other people, other voices, other moments he could have allowed to surface, but he chose this one. He chose me. He stepped slightly closer, not enough to invade my space, but enough that his voice felt more direct, more personal than before. Because you do not simplify things, he said, and the certainty in his tone left no room for argument. You sit with them, you follow them, even when they become uncomfortable, even when they stop making sense to anyone else. And that made you useful. The word should have felt transactional, but it did not. It felt accurate in a way I could not deny, because everything he described was exactly what I had done from the beginning, not because I had to, but because I could not do it any other way. I nodded slowly, more to myself than to him. The room quiet again, except for the faint hum of the city beyond the glass and the soft click of the recorder still running, still capturing everything. Then this is not just about what I heard, I said, my voice steadier, now more certain, because the pattern was clearer than before. This is about what I do next. His eyes held mine without hesitation. Exactly, he said, and that single word carried more weight than anything else, because it confirmed what I had already begun to understand. This was not a moment, this was a direction. I lifted the recorder, slightly angling it back toward him, even though I was no longer just documenting his voice. I was documenting my own decision, and I realized as I stood there that the story I would tell was not going to be about a crime or a mystery or even him. It was going to be about the space between what is real and what people choose to believe. And I was the one standing in that space now. I took a slow breath, grounding myself in the moment, then spoke clearly into the recorder, my voice steady despite everything underneath it. This is not the story I thought I was recording, and as the words left my mouth, I understood something final. This was not about finding the truth anymore. It was about whether I was willing to carry it. The room felt different after I said it, like something invisible had settled into place, not louder, not heavier, just final. I lowered the recorder slightly, but did not turn it off, the red light still blinking steady like a heartbeat that refused to stop. And I realized I did not want it to stop, because this moment, this exact shift was part of the story too, not just what he had told me, but what I had chosen to do with it. I looked at him one last time, not searching, not questioning, just seeing him clearly, now not as a mystery, not as a threat, but as something precise, something that existed beyond the way people would try to define him. You already knew I would not walk away, I said quietly, and this time it was not a question, it was recognition. He held my gaze for a second longer, then nodded, once not approval, not agreement, just acknowledgement like we had reached the same conclusion from different directions. You were never meant to, he replied, and there was no weight behind it, no expectation, just truth, the kind that did not need to be explained. I exhaled, slowly feeling something inside me settle into place, the uncertainty that had followed me from the moment I pressed record earlier replaced by something else, something steadier. I reached down and stopped the recording, the click soft but unmistakable, and for a second the silence that followed felt louder than anything that had come before. I slipped the recorder into my jacket pocket, the motion deliberate, like I was sealing something away, not hiding it, just holding it until I decided what it would become. I turned toward the door, pausing briefly with my hand on the handle, not because I was unsure, but because I understood this was the last moment where everything still existed only between us. Once I stepped outside, once I spoke, once I shared, it would no longer belong to this room, to him, or even to me. It would belong to everyone who heard it, and that thought did not scare me the way it should have. It grounded me. I opened the door and stepped back into the hallway, the quiet still there. The world unchanged, and yet completely different, because I was not the same person who had walked in. I moved down the stairs slower this time, not from hesitation, but from awareness, every step intentional, every breath steady. When I reached the street, the city felt familiar again, but not distant, like I had seen something beneath it, something most people never noticed. And now I could not unsee it. I got into my car, the recorder still resting against me, the weight of it no longer uncertain but chosen. I sat there for a moment before starting the engine, my reflection faint in the glass, looking back at me, not asking questions anymore, just waiting for what I would do next. And as I pulled away, I understood the story had never been about him, not really. It had always been about the line between hearing and understanding, and the moment you choose to cross it. And once you do not go back, you move forward, and you carry it with you. Because some stories are not meant to be told, they are meant to be held carefully, truthfully, without distortion, and the real choice is not whether you share them, it is whether you are strong enough to keep them honest in a world that constantly asks you to change them. So if you ever find yourself standing at that same line between what is easy and what is real, choose carefully, listen deeper, question what you hear, and when the moment comes, do not rush to simplify it, do not rush to turn it into something comfortable. Let it be what it is, because truth does not need to be louder to matter. It only needs to be clear, and the way you choose to carry it says more about you than the story itself ever will.